History is littered with leaders whose refusal to admit mistakes cost millions of lives, empires, and entire civilizations. Pride, fear, or sheer arrogance often masks itself as strength, yet the consequences are devastating. In this episode, we explore the top 10 times leaders refused to admit they were wrong. Stories where ego overruled reason, warnings were ignored, and the world paid the price. If you love uncovering history's hidden lessons and forbidden truths, stay tuned, and don't forget to hit subscribe. These are not just stories, they are warnings from the past. Warning 10. Stalin ignoring Nazi invasion warnings, 1941. Joseph Stalin, the man who ruled the Soviet Union with iron fists, received repeated intelligence reports warning of Hitler's impending invasion. Multiple spies and advisors, including the famously meticulous Richard Sorge, tried to convince him of Operation Barbarossa. Yet Stalin refused to believe that Hitler would betray the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. To him, accepting the possibility of a German invasion was a sign of weakness. His ego told him that Hitler would never dare attack the Soviet Union while Stalin was still consolidating power. Consequence: when the invasion finally came on June 22, 1941, millions of Soviet soldiers were unprepared. Cities burned, entire divisions were annihilated, and the USSR faced near collapse in the early months of the war. Lesson: a leader's refusal to admit the possibility of error can turn intelligence into illusion, leaving an entire nation vulnerable. Present-day parallel. Modern leaders sometimes dismiss credible warnings about cyber warfare, climate disasters, or pandemics, convinced that acknowledging vulnerability undermines authority. The echoes of Stalin's hubris are alive today in decisions made behind closed doors. Future warning. What global catastrophe today could stem from a leader refusing to admit even a hint of error? Warning 9. King Louis XVI delaying reforms, late 18th century. France was on the brink of revolution. The country faced crushing debt, famine, and social unrest. Advisors, economists, and even his own ministers begged King Louis XVI to enact reforms. Instead of facing the harsh reality, Louis clung to royal tradition and divine right. Admitting that the monarchy itself was flawed would, in his mind, diminish the crown. Consequence: delays in reform fueled resentment. The French Revolution erupted, leading to the fall of the monarchy and the eventual execution of Louis XVI. The failure to act early transformed manageable financial crises into revolutionary chaos. Lesson: pride in tradition can blind leaders to the urgency of change, allowing disaster to grow unchecked. Present-day parallel. Governments today risk similar outcomes when leaders ignore socioeconomic warning signs, inequality, environmental stress, or political unrest. Future warning. Are there monarchies, corporations, or regimes today clinging to outdated authority, blind to the pressure building beneath them? Warning 8. Saddam Hussein misreading coalition resolve, 1990–1991. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, convinced the United States and its allies would not intervene decisively. His advisors warned him that a coalition could form quickly, but Saddam's ego refused to entertain defeat, humiliation, or compromise. Consequence: the swift formation of a global coalition led to the Gulf War. Iraq faced devastating airstrikes, massive casualties, and an economy in ruins. Saddam's misreading of power dynamics and refusal to consider reality escalated what could have been a contained regional dispute into international humiliation. Lesson: leaders who overestimate their own strength and underestimate opposition risk catastrophic consequences. Present-day parallel: misjudging global alliances remains a critical danger. From trade wars to military posturing, pride-driven miscalculations can spiral uncontrollably. Future warning: how many modern conflicts could escalate simply because a leader refuses to admit misjudgment? Warning 7. Argentine generals starting the Falklands War, 1982. In 1982, Argentina's military junta faced domestic unrest, economic collapse, and a legitimacy crisis. Instead of addressing internal problems, the generals hatched a plan to invade the Falklands, Malvinas, assuming the UK would not respond forcefully. Multiple advisors cautioned against the move. The British, despite the distance, had a capable navy and public support for reclaiming the islands. Yet the generals' pride, an unwillingness to admit the fragility of their rule, overrode logic. Consequence: Argentina suffered a humiliating defeat within months. The junta collapsed, and thousands of Argentine soldiers died. What began as a gamble to strengthen power became a national tragedy. Lesson: ego-driven decisions in leadership can turn desperate measures into disasters. Pride often masquerades as strategy but conceals fatal misjudgment. Present-day parallel: nationalistic pride and authoritarian overreach continue to spark regional conflicts today, where leaders gamble with lives to assert dominance. Future warning: how many military miscalculations today stem from an inability to acknowledge internal weaknesses. Warning 6. Qin Dynasty burning books and scholars, c. 213 to 210 BCE. Qin Shi Huang, China's first emperor, unified warring states through brute force, but his fear of criticism and obsession with legacy led him to declare that any scholar questioning his rule would face execution and that non-legalist books should be burned. Advisors pleaded with him, warning that intellectual oppression would weaken society. Yet the emperor's ego equated dissent with weakness. Consequence: intellectual growth was stifled. Scholars were executed or silenced, historical texts lost forever, and China faced decades of social and cultural disruption. The dynasty itself collapsed shortly after his death. Lesson: leaders who suppress dissent to protect their ego weaken the very foundations of civilization. Knowledge and critique are lifelines, not threats. Present-day parallel: modern regimes that stifle academic freedom, journalism, or whistleblowers mirror this pattern, leaving societies vulnerable to stagnation and sudden collapse. Future warning: what cultural or technological knowledge might be lost today because leaders refuse to admit they are wrong? Warning 5. Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward Denial, 1958–1962. Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, aiming to rapidly industrialize China. When reports of widespread famine and millions of deaths reached him, he dismissed them as exaggerations, branding critics as traitors. Consequence: the denial magnified the disaster. Estimates suggest 30 to 45 million Chinese perished. A refusal to confront reality turned policy into a catastrophe of unprecedented scale. Lesson: denial at the top amplifies errors into historic tragedies. When leaders equate admitting failure with weakness, human lives become collateral. Present-day parallel: suppressing inconvenient truths, whether environmental disasters or public health crises, can compound preventable harm. Future warning: could future technological or ecological mismanagement become irreversible because leaders refuse to acknowledge early warning signs? Warning 4. Assyrian kings ruling through terror only. c. 900 to 600 BCE. The Assyrian Empire expanded through fear. Kings relied on terror, mass executions, deportations, and scorched earth tactics, rather than diplomacy or reform. Advisors occasionally suggested more sustainable governance, but the kings equated mercy with weakness. Consequence: while initially effective, ruling solely through terror bred instability. Rebellions erupted repeatedly, and eventually the empire crumbled under external invasions and internal collapse. Lesson: ego-driven authoritarianism may yield short-term control, but ignoring counsel and sustainable governance ensures eventual downfall. Present-day parallel: modern autocracies relying on fear over reform face similar risks: instability, rebellion, and eventual collapse. Future warning: how many contemporary regimes are sowing the seeds of their own collapse by equating compromise with weakness? Warning 3. Khmer Rouge refusing to stop purges. 1975–1979. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge rose to power in Cambodia promising equality and agrarian utopia. Within months, however, they unleashed a campaign of purges, targeting intellectuals, professionals, and anyone deemed a threat to their ideology. Advisors and cadres warned Pol Pot that the purges were decimating the population and crippling the country's economy. Yet he refused to stop, convinced that admitting error would be a betrayal of the revolution and a sign of weakness. Consequence: over 4 years, nearly 2 million people died, roughly a quarter of Cambodia's population. Society, infrastructure, and culture were nearly erased. Pol Pot's denial turned radical ideology into a national catastrophe. Lesson: when leaders prioritize ideology and ego over reality, the cost is measured in human lives. Denial in leadership can become mass destruction. Present-day parallel: extremist movements today that ignore warnings from humanitarian and intelligence sources can escalate violence, destabilize regions, and leave legacies of horror. Future warning: what extremist ideologies might today escalate because leaders refuse to confront internal failure? Warning 2. Ethiopian emperor ignoring modernization, late 19th, early 20th century. Emperor Menelik II and his successors faced pressure to modernize Ethiopia's military and infrastructure as European powers expanded across Africa. Advisors warned that rejecting modern weapons, technology, and administrative reforms could leave the nation vulnerable. Yet pride in tradition and fear of appearing weak delayed critical reforms. While Ethiopia managed to resist some colonization, failure to modernize fully limited development and left the country ill-prepared for later conflicts and famines. Consequence: Ethiopia's delayed modernization created long-term social, economic, and military vulnerabilities. The cost of ego-driven denial echoed for decades. Lesson: refusing to adapt to changing realities in the name of pride risks leaving nations exposed to forces beyond their control. Present-day parallel: countries that resist technological, military, or educational reforms today risk falling behind on the global stage, making them vulnerable to internal unrest or external pressure. Future warning: could a refusal to adopt essential innovations today lead to national collapse tomorrow? Warning 1. Tokugawa Shogunate rejecting foreign technology, 1603–1868. Japan's Tokugawa Shogunate ruled a period of relative peace and isolation. Foreign contact was restricted, and Western technology, guns, ships, and industrial innovations, was largely rejected. Advisors suggested adopting some foreign techniques to strengthen Japan, but the shoguns feared that change would undermine their authority and destabilize tradition. Consequence: by the mid-19th century, Japan faced a crisis when Commodore Perry forced the opening of Japan's ports. The country was suddenly confronted with technologies far beyond their current capabilities, leading to social upheaval and the eventual collapse of the shogunate. Lesson: denying progress and clinging to rigid tradition may feel safe in the short term, but history shows that adaptation is often the difference between survival and collapse. Present-day parallel: nations and leaders today who resist technological change, AI, green energy, cyber defense, may be blindsided by external shocks, just as Tokugawa Japan was. Future warning: how many societies today risk shock and upheaval because leaders equate progress with weakness? Closing reflections: across history, one pattern emerges: ego-driven denial magnifies mistakes into catastrophe. From Stalin to Pol Pot, from Louis XVI to the Tokugawa Shogunate, refusing to admit error transforms manageable crises into disasters. The dark lesson: leadership is strongest not when leaders appear infallible, but when they acknowledge mistakes and adapt. The cost of pride is often invisible until it manifests in death, collapse, or societal decay. History warns, but it also teaches. If you want more episodes uncovering forbidden truths and hidden lessons from the past, hit subscribe, and join us as we explore the dark side of human leadership.